The screech of the 6 train against the rusted tracks usually sounds like a warning, but tonight, to Elena Rigby, it sounded like a dying lullaby. Her feet weren't just aching. They felt like they'd been replaced by blocks of searing concrete after a 16-hour double shift at the Greasy Spoon. The neon lights of the subway car flickered, casting sickly yellow shadows over the exhausted faces of late-night commuters. But Elena's vision was blurring, her knees buckling under the weight of a life that demanded more than she had left to give. She didn't just need a seat, she needed a miracle to keep her from collapsing onto the dirty linoleum floor. Before we dive into this heart-pounding encounter that changes everything, hello to all of you incredible souls tuning in. It is so wonderful to have you here. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I truly treasure seeing how far our community reaches. And if you're finding yourself pulled into Elena's world already, please take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and join our family. It helps more than you know, and I'd hate for you to miss the twists coming in this story. How are you all doing today? I hope you're ready for a tale that proves fate doesn't care if you're tired, it only cares that you're his. Elena didn't see the man. She only saw the space. In the crowded, humid car, there was a gap between a sleeping construction worker and the sliding doors. A sliver of dark fabric that her sleep-deprived brain registered as an empty bench. With a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 unearned tips, she let her body drop. She didn't hit hard plastic. She hit something warm. Something terrifyingly solid. Something that felt like granite wrapped in velvet. The gasp that left her throat was strangled, her eyes snapping wide as the scent of cedarwood, cold rain, and something primal, something predatory, filled her lungs. She wasn't on the seat. She was sitting directly on the lap of a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very shadows of the city. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I didn't see," Elena stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Shaking with a mix of mortification and adrenaline, she tried to bolt upright, her hands pushing against his thighs to get leverage. But she didn't move an inch. A hand, massive and scarred across the knuckles, clamped down on her waist. The grip wasn't violent, but it was absolute. It was the grip of a man who owned the air she was breathing. Elena froze, her breath hitching as she looked up into eyes that weren't quite human. Irises the color of molten gold that seemed to glow in the dim light of the subway car. "Stay," he commanded. His voice wasn't a request. It was a low, vibrating growl that hummed through Elena's entire skeleton, settling deep in her marrow. "Sir, please, I'm exhausted. I made a mistake. Let me go," she whispered, her face flushing a deep crimson. The other passengers seemed to vanish into a blur. The only thing real was the heat radiating from him and the terrifying strength in the fingers digging into her hip. The man leaned forward, his face inches from her neck. He took a slow, deep breath, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled the scent of her sweat, her cheap lilac perfume, and the underlying sweetness of her soul. A shiver of pure, unadulterated electricity shot down Elena's spine. He didn't look angry. He looked like a starving man who had just found the only thing that could save him. "You aren't going anywhere," he murmured, his thumb brushing against the skin of her waist in a gesture that was possessive, tender, and dangerous all at once. "I've spent 300 years looking for this scent. Do you really think I'm letting you walk off at the next stop?" Elena's blood ran cold. The subway car screeched again, but the doors didn't open. The lights flickered and died, leaving them in a darkness broken only by the predatory glow of his golden eyes. She realized then that she hadn't just sat on a stranger. She had fallen into the lap of a king who had no intention of ever letting her stand up again. The darkness of the stalled subway car felt heavy, pressing against Elena's skin like a physical weight, yet it was the heat of the man beneath her that truly stifled her breath. He was a mountain of silent, coiled energy. As the emergency lights hummed to a dim, flickering red, Elena's mind raced through the exhaustion that had led her here. Only 3 hours ago she had been scrub-brushing a spilled milkshake off a cracked linoleum floor while her manager, a man who smelled eternally of stale cigarettes and disappointment, barked about her slow pace. Elena Rigby wasn't a girl who sought out destiny. She was a girl who sought out rent money and enough left over for a box of generic cereal. Since her mother had passed 3 years ago, leaving Elena with nothing but a chipped locket and a mountain of medical debt, her life had been a series of not-enoughs. Not enough sleep, not enough food, and certainly not enough hope. Her deepest fear wasn't the dark or the monsters lurking in it. It was the quiet, gnawing realization that she might spend her entire life being invisible, a ghost in a waitress uniform serving people who never looked at her face. "My name is Elena," she whispered into the gloom, her voice trembling. "I'm just a waitress. I don't know what you think you smelled, but you have the wrong person." The man's grip tightened almost imperceptibly, his fingers splaying across her hip with a proprietary grace. "I am Silas Hawthorne," he responded, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her chest. "And I have never had the wrong person in my life, Elena." Silas Hawthorne. Even in her sleep-deprived state, the name sparked a flicker of recognition. The Hawthorne family wasn't just wealthy, they were the ghost owners of the city. They owned the high-rises, the shipping docks, and whispered rumors suggested they owned the very laws of the state. But looking at him now, the raw, rugged power of his jawline, the way his shoulders seemed too broad for the narrow subway seat, he didn't look like a thief. He looked like a warlord. In the seat across from them, a man in a sharp gray suit, Silas's companion, though Elena hadn't noticed him before, watched them with an expression of clinical intensity. This was Bastian Thorne, Silas's commander of the guard, a man whose silence was more intimidating than most people's shouting. Bastian's hand stayed hovering near the lapel of his coat, eyes darting to the subway doors as if expecting an ambush from the shadows. To anyone else they looked like bodyguards. To Silas they were his pack. "The scent is unmistakable," Silas murmured, his head tilting as he watched the pulse thrumming in Elena's throat. "Like rain on dry earth and something ancient. Something that belongs only to me." Elena felt a surge of indignation cut through her fear. "I don't belong to anyone. I work 60 hours a week just to belong to myself." She tried to shift again, but the sheer mass of him made her feel like a child trying to move a boulder. "That is what you believe," Silas said, his golden eyes locking onto hers. Behind that gaze lay a secret that stretched back centuries. A history of a bloodline that ruled the forests before the concrete was ever poured. He was the Lycan King, a sovereign of a hidden world, and for 300 years he had been a king without a queen. His people were restless, the underworld was fracturing, and his own soul was becoming a barren wasteland of duty and violence. He needed the mate the prophecy promised, the one whose scent would calm the beast within him. He hadn't expected to find her on a grime-streaked subway car smelling of cheap coffee. "You look like you're about to faint," Silas noted, his tone shifting from predatory to a terrifyingly soft concern. He adjusted her, pulling her back so her head rested against his shoulder. "Sleep, Elena. The city can wait. My world, however, has waited long enough. I can't. I have to get home." She drifted, the sheer physical exhaustion finally winning the battle against her adrenaline. The cedarwood scent was intoxicating, acting like a sedative on her frayed nerves. "You are home," Silas whispered, a promise and a threat entwined in one. As her eyes drifted shut, she didn't see Bastian lean in to whisper to his king. "The Silver Fang assassins are 2 cars down, sire," Bastian muttered. "They sensed the surge when you found her. They won't let us leave the tunnel." Silas didn't flinch. He simply tucked Elena closer, his hand shielding her head. "Then they will die in the dark. No one touches what is mine." The subway car didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt hollow, as if the air itself was being sucked out by an approaching storm. Elena's eyes snapped open as a violent jolt rocked the train, a sound like grinding metal screaming through the tunnel. She tried to bolt upright, the instinct to run finally overriding her exhaustion, but Silas's arm was a band of iron across her midsection, anchoring her to his lap. "Stay down," he growled, his voice dropping an octave into a register that felt less like a man and more like a landslide. "What's happening? Why are we stopping?" Elena gasped, her hands clutching at Silas's expensive wool coat. Through the glass of the subway doors she saw shadows, fast, flickering blurs that moved with a speed no human could possess. They weren't commuters. They were predators. "Change of plans, Elena," Silas said, his golden eyes narrowing as he looked toward the end of the car. "The world I told you about. It just decided to introduce itself." Suddenly, the glass of the rear door shattered inward, exploding in a rain of crystalline shards. 2 figures lunged through the opening. They were dressed in tactical black, but their faces were distorted, snouts elongated, teeth jagged and white against the dim emergency red light. These were the Silver Fang assassins, and they weren't here for a talk. They were here to bleed the king. Bastian. Silas barked. In a blur of motion, Bastian Thorne was out of his seat. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled a curved blade that seemed to drink the meager light in the room. With a roar that shook the very bolts of the train car, Bastian met the first assassin mid-air. The sound of their collision was sickening, the crack of bone and the tearing of fabric. Elena screamed, burying her face in Silas's chest as the smell of copper, warm, fresh blood, filled the cramped space. This wasn't a mugging. This was a war. "Look at me," Silas commanded, grabbing her chin and forcing her to meet his burning gaze. "Elena, look at me." She obeyed, her body shaking so hard her teeth chattered. What are you?" "I am your protector," he said, and for the first time he let the mask of the billionaire CEO slip. His canines lengthened and his fingernails sharpened into obsidian points. "And those things out there? They want to take you to hurt me. I will not let that happen." The second assassin bypassed Bastian, leaping over the seats with unnatural agility, its eyes fixed solely on Elena. It let out a guttural hiss, its claws extended to rip her from Silas's arms. Silas didn't even stand up. He shifted Elena to his left arm, shielding her body with his own, and with his right hand he caught the assassin by the throat mid-leap. The force of the catch sent a shockwave through the floorboards. With a casual, terrifying display of strength, Silas squeezed. Elena heard the snap of a windpipe, a sound like a dry branch breaking, before Silas tossed the lifeless body aside like a piece of trash. "We have to move," Silas said, standing up now and lifting Elena effortlessly into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "The tunnel is crawling with them. The doors won't open." Elena cried, pointing at the jammed emergency release. Silas didn't look for a handle. He stepped toward the side doors and kicked. The reinforced steel buckled, flying off its hinges and clattering into the dark, damp tunnel outside. He stepped out into the gloom, the sound of water dripping and the distant howls of a pack echoing through the subterranean labyrinth. "Wait!" Elena gasped, clutching his neck. "My bag. My phone. My life is back there." Silas paused, his face illuminated by a stray spark from the third rail. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Your old life ended the moment you sat on my lap, Elena. From this moment on, your life is whatever I say it is." He turned and broke into a run, moving through the darkness at a pace that made the wind whip against Elena's face. She looked back one last time at the flickering lights of the subway car, seeing more shadows pouring in. She was being kidnapped by a monster to be saved from other monsters, and as the heat of his body seeped into hers, she realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't sure which prospect frightened her more. "Before we see where Silas is taking our terrified waitress, I have to ask. If you were in Elena's shoes, would you trust the man who just saved your life or the darkness he's running into? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying the suspense, don't forget to subscribe. The real mystery is just beginning." The damp, metallic air of the subway tunnels whipped past Elena's face as Silas ran with a speed that defied human physics. Every step he took resonated with the power of an avalanche, yet he held her with such terrifying gentleness that she felt like a fragile porcelain doll in the arms of a titan. The flickering emergency lights of the maintenance shafts cast long, distorted shadows against the grime-covered walls, and behind them the rhythmic, guttural howling of the Silver Fong pack grew louder, echoing through the concrete labyrinth. "Close your eyes, Elena," Silas commanded, his breath steady despite the frantic pace. "And do not open them until I tell you." She didn't argue. She buried her face into the crook of his neck, the scent of cedar and ozone acting as her only anchor in a world that had suddenly turned into a nightmare. She felt a sudden jarring shift in the air, a transition from the stagnant subterranean dampness to a sharp, biting cold. The sound of rushing wind replaced the echoes of the tunnel. When he finally came to a halt, the silence was absolute. "You can look now," he murmured. Elena opened her eyes and gasped. They weren't in the city anymore. They stood on a jagged stone balcony overlooking a sprawling, mist-shrouded valley. Behind them rose a fortress of black stone and glass, a modern marvel of architecture built into the side of a mountain. Below, the lights of a private estate glimmered like fallen stars against the dark velvet of the forest. Where are we?" she whispered, her legs shaking as he finally set her down. Her waitress uniform, stained with coffee and the sweat of her double shift, looked absurd against the opulence of the balcony's marble floor. "The North Peak Sanctuary," Silas said, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "My home. The only place on this coast where the silver fangs cannot reach you." As he spoke, Bastian Thorn emerged from the shadows of the doorway, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with the dark, thick blood of the creatures from the tunnel. He looked exhausted, but his eyes remained sharp. "The perimeter is secure, sire. But they've tasted her scent. They won't stop at the tunnels. They'll be gathering the others." "Let them gather," Silas said, his voice cold and sharp as a blade. "They will find only graves at my gate." He turned back to Elena, his gaze softening in a way that felt almost more dangerous than his anger. He reached out, his large hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled back as if remembering her fear. "You are trembling. Bastian, have the staff prepare the lunar suite. And get her something to eat that wasn't wrapped in plastic at a bodega." "I don't want a suite," Elena snapped, her fear finally boiling over into a desperate, weary anger. "I want to go back to my apartment. I have a shift tomorrow at 6 a.m. My landlord will evict me if I'm late with this month's rent, and—" "Elena," Silas interrupted, stepping into her space. The sheer magnetism of him was overwhelming. "Your landlord is a man named Mr. Henderson who overcharges you for a studio with a leaking radiator. As of 5 minutes ago, I bought the building. You don't owe him a cent. You don't owe anyone anything except your safety to me." Elena blinked, stunned. You bought my apartment building?" "I don't like my property being handled by incompetent men," Silas said simply. The tension between them was thick, a physical cord of attraction and resentment. Elena hated that he had stripped away her autonomy, yet she couldn't deny the way her heart hammered against her ribs when he looked at her. It wasn't just fear, it was a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, the feeling of being seen. Later that night, after a bath in a tub the size of her entire kitchen and dressed in silk robes that cost more than her yearly salary, Elena wandered the halls of the sanctuary. She found Silas in a library filled with leather-bound books that smelled of history. He was staring at an old map, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a faint glowing mark on his chest, a crest of a wolf entwined with a rose. "Why me?" she asked softly, leaning against the doorframe. "There are thousands of women in that city. Why did fate put me on that train in that seat?" Silas turned, the moonlight catching the amber in his eyes. "Because the universe is tired of us being apart, Elena. For 3 centuries my kind has survived, but we haven't lived. My beast is a storm that never ends, but when you sat on my lap, for the first time in 300 years the storm went quiet." He walked toward her, each step deliberate. Elena felt the urge to run, but her feet were frozen. When he stopped, he was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "I am a king of monsters," he whispered, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "But for you I would be a man. If you let me." Elena looked up at him, her breath hitching. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, a mirror to her own. But just as she reached out to touch his hand, a frantic pounding echoed through the heavy oak doors of the library. Bastian burst in, his face pale. "Sire, we have a problem. The scouts found something in the woods. It's not just the silver fangs. They found the bloodlock. They know how to get inside." Silas's expression went stone cold. He turned to Elena, his grip on her arm firm. "Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me." "Silas, what's a bloodlock?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He only looked at her with a hunger that terrified her. "The truth is more dangerous than the lie, Elena. Pray you never have to find out." The library was a tomb of silence after Silas and Bastian vanished into the corridors of the sanctuary. Elena stood frozen, the silk of her robe feeling like a shroud against her skin. The bloodlock. The word echoed in her mind, pulsing with an ancient, heavy dread. She paced the room, her fingers trailing over the spines of books that had existed before her great-grandparents were born. Restlessness gnawed at her. She wasn't a woman who stayed put. You didn't survive double shifts by waiting for permission to move. Against Silas's explicit command, Elena pressed her ear to the heavy oak door. Hearing nothing but the distant whistle of the mountain wind, she turned the iron handle. It clicked open. The hallway was bathed in the eerie rhythmic pulse of blue emergency lights. She followed the sound of raised voices, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She reached a set of massive double doors slightly ajar. The war room. The prophecy didn't say she was a waitress, Silas. Bastian's voice was a harsh whip crack. It said she was the key. If the Silver Fangs realize that her blood doesn't just call to your beast, but unlocks the primordial well, they won't just kill her. They'll drain her. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She pressed closer to the gap, her breath hitching. I know what she is, Bastian, Silas roared, the sound followed by the heavy thud of a fist hitting a stone table. I knew the moment she sat on me. I felt the seal on her soul crack. She isn't just my mate. She's the descendant of the high priestess who bound our kind to these mountains. Her life is the only thing keeping the great eclipse from being permanent. Then you're lying to her, Bastian countered. You're keeping her here as a shield for our people, not just because you love her. Does she know her father wasn't a runaway? Does she know he was a guardian who died protecting her sent from us? Elena felt the world tilt. Her father. The man who had supposedly walked out on her mother when Elena was 3. The man she had spent a lifetime hating for his absence. He hadn't left, he had been a guardian. And Silas. It doesn't matter what she knows yet, Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, possessive whisper. She is mine. By blood, by fate, and by the law of the pack. I will use every drop of her power to ensure my kingdom never falls. If that means she stays in a gilded cage, then so be it. Elena backed away, a sob rising in her throat. She wasn't a woman to him, she was a battery. A historical artifact. Every tender look, every protective gesture in that subway car. It wasn't about Elena Rigby, the girl who liked poetry and burnt toast. It was about the power flowing through her veins. You liar, she breathed, her voice trembling. She turned to run, but the shadows in the hallway seemed to coalesce. A figure stepped out of the gloom. Not Silas, not Bastian, but a woman with eyes like cold chips of ice and hair the color of bone. He didn't tell you the best part, little key, the woman sneered. In order to unlock the well and save his kingdom, Silas has to break you. Literally. The ritual requires the heart of the priestess to be willing, or broken. Elena didn't wait to hear more. She spun around and bolted toward the balcony she had seen earlier, the wind howling as she burst into the night air. The betrayal tasted like ash. She looked down at the sheer drop of the mountain, then back at the door where Silas was now emerging, his face a mask of horror as he saw her standing on the edge. Elena, step back, he shouted, his hand outstretched. The woman you saw, she's a hallucination, a mental strike from the Silver Fangs. Is it a lie, Silas? Elena screamed over the wind. Am I just a key to you? Did my father die because of your kind? Silas paused, his golden eyes flickering with a guilt that confirmed everything. It's complicated, Elena. Please let me explain. You bought my building to track me, she realized, her voice breaking. You waited for me on that train. It wasn't an accident. The sky above them began to bleed a deep, unnatural violet. The bloodlock had been triggered, not by an enemy, but by her own realization. The ground beneath the sanctuary groaned, and a pillar of light erupted from the forest below, centered directly on Elena. She wasn't just sitting on a king's lap anymore. She was sitting on the trigger of a war that had been brewing for centuries, and the man she was starting to trust was the one holding the match. The violet light erupting from the valley floor wasn't just a beacon. It was a physical force that tore through the mountain air, chilling Elena's blood. She stood on the precipice of the balcony, the wind whipping her silk robe around her like a funeral shroud. The revelation that Silas had orchestrated their meeting, that her entire life of hardship might have been a calculated wait for her power to ripen, felt like a physical blow to her chest. Elena, step away from the edge. Silas roared, his voice cracking with a desperation she hadn't heard before. He took a step toward her, but the ground between them buckled, a fissure of obsidian stone splitting the marble. Was anything real? Elena cried, her voice barely audible over the rising gale. The way you looked at me on the train? The way you held me? Or was that just you checking that it was still in its lock? Silas's face contorted, his golden eyes flickering wildly between human remorse and the predatory hunger of his wolf. I am a king, Elena. I have duties that span centuries. But when I felt you, when you sat there, I forgot the crown. I forgot the well. I only felt you. Liar, she screamed. Before Silas could reach her, the shadows on the balcony didn't just move, they solidified. A dozen silver Fong assassins, their fur matted with the blood of the outer guards, vaulted over the stone railing. They didn't go for Silas. They swarmed Elena. No. Silas lunged, his body shifting midair into a form of terrifying lethal grace. His claws tore through the first two attackers, but there were too many. A massive, gray-furred Lycan, his eyes clouded with cataracts and madness, grabbed Elena by the throat. He didn't squeeze to kill, he squeezed to silence. The key belongs to the eclipse now, the creature hissed, its breath smelling of rot and ancient magic. With a violent jerk, the assassin threw himself, and Elena, off the balcony. Elena! Silas's scream echoed off the mountain peaks, a sound of such pure, unadulterated agony that it seemed to stop the very wind. He didn't hesitate. He dove after them, a dark streak against the violet sky. The fall was a blur of freezing air and the terrifying sensation of weightlessness. Elena felt the Lycan's claws digging into her shoulders as they plummeted toward the dense canopy of the blackwood forest. Branches shattered like glass around them, tearing at her skin and silk. They hit a ledge halfway down the cliff with a bone-jarring thud. Elena's world went black for a moment. When her vision cleared, she was pinned against the damp earth of a shallow cave. The gray Lycan stood over her, his claws hovering over her chest. "The Bloodlock is hungry, little priestess," the creature growled. "Silas kept you in a cage of gold. I will give you to the stars." He slashed. Elena screamed, throwing her arm up to protect her face. The claws raked across her forearm, and as her blood hit the soil of the mountain, the violet light intensified, turning into a blinding, searing white. The ground began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that made Elena's teeth ache. Silas landed 10 feet away, his landing shattering the stone beneath his feet. He was covered in blood, his clothes shredded, his chest heaving. But he stopped. He saw the blood on the ground. He saw the light. "You're too late, Hawthorne," the assassin laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. "The ritual has begun. She is bleeding for us now. The well is opening, and your kingdom will burn in the shadow of the eclipse." Silas looked at Elena, not at the power radiating from her, but at the tears tracking through the dirt on her face. He looked at the wound he had spent 300 years trying to prevent. The silence between them was a chasm wider than the one they had just fallen through. "I lost her," Silas whispered to himself, his shoulders slumping. "I lied to protect the crown, and I lost the only thing that made the crown worth wearing." The silver Fong raised his claws for the killing blow, intending to drain her completely to finish the ritual. Elena looked at Silas, seeing the king broken, seeing the man she had briefly loved reduced to a shadow of himself. She felt the coldness of the blood loss creeping into her limbs. For the first time in her life, the exhaustion wasn't from a shift at the diner. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had no more reasons to fight. "Just let it happen," Elena whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. "I'm so tired of being used." The cave filled with the sound of 1,000 snarling wolves. The eclipse was starting. The moon began to slide over the sun, casting the world into a sickly, artificial twilight. Silas stood frozen, caught between the king who needed to save his people and the man who had just destroyed the woman he was destined to love. The sickly twilight of the eclipse bled across the cave floor, turning the spilled blood of the key into a shimmering, toxic gold. Elena felt the life draining out of her, not just from the wound on her arm, but from the crushing weight of the betrayal. Around them, the forest groaned as the primordial well began to siphon the very essence of the mountain. The gray Lycan assassin loomed over her, his claws dripping with her essence. "The world ends in shadow, little priestess," he hissed, his eyes reflecting the black sun above. "And you are the spark that went out." But Silas Hawthorne didn't stay broken. A low, guttural sound began to vibrate in his chest, a sound that wasn't the roar of a king, but the howl of a mate who had seen enough. The air around him began to crackle with blue static. His eyes didn't just glow, they ignited into twin suns of molten gold. "I am the king of the North Peak," Silas whispered, his voice echoing with the power of 10,000 ancestors. "And I do not permit this ending." In a blur of motion that defied the laws of the physical world, Silas didn't attack the assassin. He did something far more dangerous. He lunged toward Elena, thrusting his own chest onto the assassin's outstretched claws. The sound of the blade-like nails piercing Silas's heart center was sickening. Elena's eyes snapped open, a scream dying in her throat as she saw the man who had lied to her, the man who had trapped her, now using his own body as a shield. Silas, she gasped, her hand instinctively reaching for him. The bloodlock. It needs a sacrifice to open, Silas choked out, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth as he gripped the assassin's wrists with hands that were turning into massive fur-covered paws. But it only needs the blood of a king to close. He twisted, the strength of his desperation snapping the assassin's arms like dry kindling. With a final explosive surge of power, Silas hurled the creature off the ledge and into the abyss. He collapsed to his knees beside Elena, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. Why? Elena sobbed, pressing her hands against the massive wound in his chest. You said I was just the key. You said you'd use me. Silas looked at her, and for the first time, there was no royalty in his gaze. No prophecy. Just a man. I said a lot of things to convince myself I wasn't just a lonely fool on a subway train. He reached out, his bloodied fingers trembling as they touched her cheek. You aren't the key, Elena. You're the door. You're the only way I ever found my way back to being human. As his blood mingled with hers on the cavern floor, the violet light shifted. The mountain didn't take, it gave. The ancient magic of the High Priestess, dormant in Elena's DNA, recognized the sacrifice of the king. A surge of warmth, pure white and healing, erupted from the point where their blood met. The wound on Elena's arm began to knit itself back together. The crushing exhaustion that had haunted her since her first shift at the diner vanished, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful clarity. She wasn't just a waitress. She was the balance. You're not dying, Elena commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. She grabbed Silas's hand, lacing her fingers with his. You don't get to leave me in this mess, Silas Hawthorne. You bought my building, remember? You still owe me a working radiator. A ghost of a smile touched Silas's lips. The blue light of the well began to wrap around them, not as a cage but as a cocoon. Above them, the moon began to tremble, losing its grip on the sun. The pack is coming, Bastian's voice echoed from the ledge above, followed by the sound of a dozen loyal Lycans descending the cliffside. The Silver Fangs are retreating. The king has closed the gate. He didn't close it, Elena whispered, looking into Silas's eyes as the strength returned to his limbs, the magic of their bond accelerating his healing. We did. She realized then that the prophecy hadn't been about a king using a key. It was about a king surrendering his crown to a girl who had nothing but her heart. The tension of the last hour broke, replaced by a fierce, burning determination. The eclipse was failing. The light was returning. And for the first time in 300 years, the Lycan King had a reason to stand up, not as a tyrant but as a partner. The air in the cavern didn't just vibrate, it shattered. As the white light of the stabilized well surged through Elena and Silas, the sickly violet of the eclipse was torn asunder. But the Silver Fangs weren't finished. From the mouth of the cave, a monstrous roar erupted. The alpha of the assassins, a beast the size of a small vehicle with fur like jagged obsidian, lunged from the shadows. He had seen the well close, and if he couldn't have the power, he would have their heads. Silas, watch out. Elena cried, her voice ringing with a strange melodic power that seemed to ripple through the air itself. Silas, his chest still slick with the blood of his sacrifice but his eyes burning with a rejuvenated celestial fire, didn't flinch. He stood, pulling Elena behind him in one fluid motion. He wasn't just a Lycan anymore. He was the conduit of the mountain's ancient protection. When he roared back, the sound didn't just shake the stone, it leveled the trees outside. The alpha struck, his massive claws whistling through the air. Silas caught the beast's wrists, the impact sending a shockwave that cracked the cave ceiling. You fought for a crown of shadows, Silas growled, his muscles bulging with a strength that was no longer just physical. But you forgot who guards the light. With a guttural heave, Silas threw the alpha against the jagged cavern wall. Before the beast could recover, Bastian and the loyal North Peak guards swarmed the cave entrance, their silver-edged blades flashing in the returning sunlight. The battle was brief but brutal, a whirlwind of fur, steel, and the desperate snarls of a dying rebellion. Elena didn't hide. She felt the ancient magic of the high priestess humming in her palms, a warm golden glow that responded to her intent. When a stray assassin broke through the line, lunging for Silas's exposed back, Elena didn't scream. She reached out, her fingers splaying. A burst of pure, radiant energy erupted from her heart, striking the assassin midair and throwing him back into the abyss. Silas turned, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound awe. He saw her then, not as the exhausted waitress from the 6th train, but as the sovereign she was always meant to be. The Alpha, cornered and bleeding, made one final desperate move. He lunged not for Silas, but for the stone pedestal that housed the physical heart of the well. "If we cannot rule the night, no one shall see the day," he screamed, his claws raised to shatter the source of the mountain's life. "No." Silas leapt, but he was too far. In that split second, Elena didn't think, she felt. She remembered the feeling of the subway seat, the moment she let go and trusted the man beneath her. She channeled that surrender into the magic. She slammed her palm onto the cavern floor. A wall of solid, translucent amber erupted from the stone, encasing the well's heart in a shield that no claw could pierce. The Alpha crashed into the shield, his claws shattering against the divine barrier. Silas was on him in an instant. With a final, decisive snap of his jaws, Silas ended the threat of the silver fangs forever. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. The sun finally broke free from the moon's shadow, flooding the valley with a warmth that tasted like victory. Bastien knelt, pressing his forehead to his blade. One by one the other guards followed suit, their heads bowed. But they weren't bowing to Silas. They were bowing to the woman in the torn silk robe. Silas turned to Elena, his shift receding, leaving him human once more, bruised, bloodied, but utterly transformed. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy with a sudden, uncharacteristic hesitation. "You saved us," he whispered, looking at the glowing shield she had created. "You didn't just close the gate. You mastered it." Elena let the shield fade, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to recede. She looked at the man who had bought her apartment building, lied to her, bled for her, and finally stood by her side. The anger was still there, a faint ember, but it was drowned out by the realization that they were no longer bound by a prophecy or a bloodlock. They were bound by the choice they had just made in the dark. "I'm still not going back to that diner, Silas," she said, her voice shaky but firm. Silas reached out, his hand cupping her face with a reverence that made her heart ache. "The diner doesn't exist anymore, Elena. Neither does the king who thought he could own you. There is only us." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. In the light of the new day, the key and the king vanished, leaving behind two souls who had found home in the middle of a war. The morning sun didn't just rise over the north peak. It seemed to scrub the world clean, turning the jagged obsidian of the sanctuary into a beacon of shimmering glass. Inside the great hall, the air was no longer thick with the scent of ancient dust and secrets. It smelled of jasmine, pine, and the faint, lingering sweetness of lilac, Elena's scent, now permanently woven into the stone of the mountain. Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lunar suite, no longer wearing a stained waitress uniform or a borrowed silk robe. She wore a gown of deep emerald, the color of the forest she had protected, and on her forearm a faint silvery scar remained, a permanent reminder that she was the bridge between two worlds. A pair of strong, familiar arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Silas pulled her back against his chest, his chin resting in the crook of her neck. He was dressed in a simple black sweater, the terrifying king of the subway replaced by a man who looked like he had finally found a reason to breathe. "The council is waiting," Silas murmured, his voice a warm hum against her skin. "They want to discuss the new treaties with the coastal pacts. They're terrified of you, you know. A priestess who can summon amber shields tends to make old wolves nervous." Elena turned in his arms, her hands sliding up to rest on his shoulders. "Let them be nervous. It'll keep them honest. Besides, I told Bastien that if anyone mentions the word key or prophecy today, I'm doubling their training drills." Silas laughed, a genuine chest-shaking sound that Elena had come to realize was her favorite melody. "You've been a queen for 3 days and you're already more terrifying than I ever was." "I'm not a queen, Silas," she corrected him softly, her eyes searching his. "I'm a partner. There's a difference." A difference I'm grateful for every second, he whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, it wasn't a crown that sat inside. It was a simple, elegant key made of rose gold, fashioned into a necklace. I had the royal jewelers melt down the old bloodlock seals. I wanted you to have the only key that matters now, the one to my home. Not as a guest but as the woman who owns it. Elena felt a lump form in her throat as he fastened the chain around her neck. She thought back to that cramped, flickering subway car, the exhaustion, the fear, and the moment her knees had buckled. She had thought it was the end of her rope, but it had been the beginning of her life. The city below was still there, humming with millions of lives, but Elena Rigby was no longer a ghost serving coffee to people who didn't see her. She was seen, she was loved, and she was powerful. "Silas?" she asked as they walked toward the heavy oak doors to meet their people. "Yes, my love. Did you ever fix the radiator in my old apartment?" Silas smirked, a flash of the predatory charm that had first drawn her in. "I did better than that. I turned the entire building into a subsidized housing complex for struggling students and workers. And yes, the heat works perfectly." Elena stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of victory, redemption, and a future that was no longer written in blood but in choice. As they stepped out onto the balcony to greet the cheering pack below, the golden light of the North Peak bathed them both. The war was over, the eclipse was a memory, and the waitress who had accidentally sat on a king's lap had finally found the one place in the world where she was meant to stay. Thank you all so much for joining me on this incredible journey with Elena and Silas. I truly hope you enjoyed watching their world transform from a dark subway tunnel to a mountain of light. Stories like these remind us that even when we feel at our most exhausted, fate might just be preparing us for a throne. What was your favorite moment? Was it the subway encounter or Elena's incredible shield in the cave? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to the channel. We have so many more emotional, high-stakes stories coming your way, and I'd love for you to be a part of our growing community. Until next time, stay safe and keep believing in the magic of the unexpected.